I wanted to take an opportunity just to tell you how Jesus supernaturally introduced himself to me. I grew up in a city called Beechwood, Ohio. It's an eastern suburb in Cleveland, Ohio, and it's actually listed as the second highest concentration of Jewish people in the world outside of Israel. So I grew up in a very extremely Jewish neighborhood, not so much religiously, but just culturally. I mean, almost everybody that I knew in Beechwood was Jewish. All my friends were Jewish growing up. I knew nothing about Jesus. I never heard about Jesus. No one had ever talked to me about Jesus. I had never read the New Testament. I don't even think I knew what the New Testament was. In other words, Jesus was as far away from me as the man on the moon. Now, I was bar mitzvahed in a conservative synagogue at the age of 13, and when I was done with my Hebrew education leading up to my bar mitzvah, we pretty much just did the traditional things that Jewish families did, and in my area we celebrated Passover, the holy days, etc. But I didn't really know God in a personal way. I was never taught to know God in a personal way. And so I grew up with a very strong faith in God, but I didn't really know him personally, and I didn't really have a strong doctrinal framework for who this God was. Well, as my life continued on after Hebrew school, I started developing a very strong desire to be an athlete in the sport of wrestling. I made a goal for myself that I was going to be the best wrestler at my weight class in the entire state. I was so focused, I trained like a professional athlete. I lived it, ate it, drank it, slept it, trained all year long. In fact, I would go to sleep every night, turn on my record player, and as I listened to the music, I would envision myself with my hand raised as state champ, the best wrestler in my weight class in Ohio, and chills would go through my body every night. And everything was good until I walked off that wrestling mat after wrestling that last match in high school. Because when I walked off the wrestling mat and I looked into the future, I realized that this sport really didn't mean anything in the larger world. And because I had focused on wrestling for so long and didn't think outside that box, I wasn't prepared. And suddenly, I went from feeling like I was on top of the world and in control of life because there wasn't anybody that I didn't think I could beat in my world of wrestling. Now, as I walked off that wrestling mat and looked into the future, realizing how big the world was, I realized that I wasn't in control, that I wasn't on top. I was actually very small and very vulnerable, and just like that, I became afraid, and I lost my purpose. This state paralyzed me, and I didn't know what to do to escape it. When I was in college my first year, I went to the University of Tampa in Florida. I spent as much time as I could just sleeping to escape the psychological torment I was in because I just didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to get that feeling back that wrestling gave me. I started thinking, what can I do to feel better? And I thought about becoming a doctor, but the truth is, I don't have the aptitude to become a doctor. I thought about becoming a lawyer, and I thought, you know what, that's possible, but here's what bothered me. I thought, even if you become a great lawyer, and even if you begin to feel satisfaction from this great law practice that you could build, I asked myself, what will happen when you're 65 and retire from law? I said to myself, you're going to feel just like you do now that wrestling ended. You'll have built your life on something that's going to end. And when it ends, what are you going to feel like? So I knew that money didn't solve everybody's problems, but I didn't know what would solve my problem. So I just thought, you know what, just try to make a lot of money and see if it makes you feel better. Now this is going back to 1978, so quite a few years ago. My plan was I was going to open up a discotheque because at the time, discotheques were really popular in the United States. I mean, there were lines going back sometimes for blocks and blocks for people waiting just to get in. So I thought, if you put a discotheque in the right location, it's going to be a gold mine. My plan was to find the right location and put the business plan together and then to look for investors, friends of the family, to invest in this business venture that I had in mind. Well, to make enough money to travel around the country, I got a job selling encyclopedias door to door. This was when door-to-door encyclopedia sales was still really strong. And soon I was promoted to a sales manager. I've got my own crew and I'm doing very well. There's a sales managers meeting one night, and I get to the sales managers meeting. We're waiting for others to arrive. There was just one other sales manager there and myself, and he begins to tell me about this book he was reading about this Swami from India that he said could levitate off the ground and beat up tigers with his bare hands. And I thought, wow, it fascinated me. I was so fascinated by this that I went out and bought this book. It was called Autobiography of a Yogi. And as I started devouring this book, I couldn't believe it. I said, if this is real, if this guy can really levitate off the ground, and if he can really do this, I found my new wrestling. This is what I want to do. I want to spend the rest of my life doing whatever spiritual work I need to do to be able to levitate off the ground. I said to myself, this is a higher reality than making money. And I imagined you would feel so good to be able to levitate off the ground. So I'm really just captivated by this. In fact, I got in my van from Cleveland, Ohio, where I was living, and drove all the way to California to visit this guy's temple. I'm totally immersed in this. I get back home to my home. I set up this little New Age temple in my bedroom, and then I go to sleep one night. Now, keep in mind where I began. My friends were Jewish. I had never read the New Testament. No one had ever talked to me about Jesus. Jesus was as far away to me as the man on the moon. I go to sleep one night in the middle of reading this book. I'm 20 years old. In the middle of the night, this hot summer August night, I'm awoken from my sleep into what I call a supernaturally conscious state of awareness. Suddenly, I'm aware that I'm not sleeping. My eyes are still closed, and in an instant, Jesus appeared to me in color on the cross. There were people in the distance looking at him as he was on the cross, and then a ray of red light from straight through the sky beamed down on Yeshua's head. And when that ray of red light, I knew him as Jesus at the time as an American, when that ray of red light beamed down on Jesus' head, I knew that that red light was coming from God, since it was coming from straight through the sky. And I knew as an American that the person on the cross was Jesus, even though I knew nothing about him. I knew in an instant that God was sharing with me that he was alive, that he cared about me, and that Jesus was the way to him. I woke up. I looked at my clock radio. It was 3:30 in the morning, and I knew that something had changed dramatically and drastically in my life. I knew that I'd found my answer. Because remember, I was lost and I was seeking. But when God appeared to me in the middle of the night, I knew that Jesus was the way to what I was looking for. I woke up the next morning, started telling my family about it. Because I was so naive, I thought they'd be excited too, because we never talked about Jesus in my home. So I had no idea what I was in for as a Jew. My mom's a Jew, my dad's a Jew. Again, raised in a Jewish neighborhood, bar mitzvah in a conservative synagogue. I had no idea what I was about to face. At first, my parents didn't react too much because they thought it was just a dream and it would be over in a few days. But when they saw I kept on talking about it, I kept telling everybody about it, somebody said to me, you need to go get a New Testament. So I went out, I bought a New Testament. I started devouring it. I mean, it was like the words were coming off the pages as fire to me. I kept on talking about it. I'd go up to my dad, I'd say, Dad, look at this verse in the Bible. I was so excited. Well, again, I was naive. I didn't realize how my parents were interpreting all this. What my parents ended up doing is they went out and they hired the most famous deprogrammer in the country to kidnap me and deprogram me. This really happened. So long story short, my dad told me, listen, I'm thinking about buying a restaurant. We'll be in business together. Don't make any plans. He said we're going to go and meet this potential business partner. So Sunday came. We went to drive to this hotel in Beechwood, Ohio. I walked in the hotel room, and as the door opens, there's a man in the room. There's two other guys in the room, both of them over 6'2", probably both of them over 240 pounds. I walk in the room. My parents walk in the room. The door closes behind me, and the businessman that was in the room looks at me and said, Kurt, we're going to talk about cults. And then he starts showing me a film of the Hare Krishnas, and he points to a little 2-year-old in the film. He said, you see that little kid? There's nothing we can do for that kid. All he's ever known is Hare Krishna. But you, he said to me, you've been living for 20 years like a normal person, and now you've been brainwashed by the Bible and whoever is brainwashing you, and we're going to snap you out of it. And he said, and I consider it a personal challenge. And I said to him, I'm not programmed. I just believe that Jesus is the Messiah. He said, well, then you've got nothing to worry about. So I stood up. I said, well, can I leave? And one of the big bodyguards that he had with him in the room said to me, sit down. And I knew I wasn't going anywhere. A little while later, I asked to go to the restroom. There was a bathroom in the hotel room. They said, yeah. So I went into the bathroom. I got down on my knees. I still remember it all these years later, 40 years later. I said, Lord, I said, I don't know what I'm about to go through now, but I just ask you to keep me. Well, they stayed with me. One of the guys slept in my room that night. The next day, we got in my van. They took me to California where they had their rehabilitation house set up. Their rehabilitation basically consisted of, we've got to separate him from whoever's programming him. So they kept me there for several weeks. Nothing changed. And eventually they just let me go home. I went back home. I tried to be a little less vocal, but I guess I wasn't less vocal enough, because it wasn't too long after that my parents, without telling me in advance, invited a Jewish psychiatrist over my home. I was actually feeling good at this time in my life, and I was starting to get strong again. Remember, I was recuperating from having lost wrestling, which was my identity in my life, and now I found Yeshua, and all of a sudden, new life is rising in me. I'm starting to find new purpose and new strength and new identity. So when the psychiatrist comes over, we sit down at my kitchen table there, my dining room table. He just asked me a question. He was trying to bait me to tell him that I had a vision of Jesus so he could probate me to the mental ward of a hospital in Cleveland. So he just asked me a few questions, and I just started telling him what Jesus had done for me. And I was so inspired, and so proud to be able to be a witness for Jesus. I remember after our meeting ended, I went over to one of my friend's house. By this time I had some Christian friends. I was going to church, and I started telling my Christian friend how I witnessed to this Jewish psychiatrist. I was so proud of myself for the inspired witness that I gave him, without knowing that the psychiatrist was just waiting for me to tell him that I had a vision of Jesus. Well, the psychiatrist went to the hospital, and he got a permission to have me probated to the psychiatric ward there, because in those days, by the witness of one psychiatrist, somebody could be probated. And all he had to do was saying, this guy's having hallucinations, he's dangerous, even though I was completely, I had no criminal record, I had never hurt anybody, there was no danger anywhere. But he was doing what my parents hired him to do. My parents thought if we can get him confined to a hospital where he can't get out of here, we can isolate him and, bring him back to ourselves, to bring him back to the KIRT we used to know. So I'm in the psychiatric ward for 2 months. It was the worst time in my life. It was terrible. Every morning I would get up with all this energy. There was no place I could go, nothing I could do. Finally, after 2 months, the law required that somebody that had been probated by the testimony of a psychiatrist had an opportunity now to testify for himself. So in 2 months, I went before a board of psychiatrists and was able to speak for myself as to whether I needed to be in this institution or not. I shared with them my story, who I was, what I was about, and they said, we have no reason to hold him here. And they released me just like that. And so I continued on in my life of pursuing the Lord. Well, to try to shorten up what really is a long, dramatic story, I married my wife, Cynthia, and graduated from Bible school in 1985. And here I am today, hosting Discovering the Jewish Jesus, which broadcasts now all over the world, close to 200 countries around the world, reaching Jewish people and Gentiles alike, just like we're supposed to be as Jews, as a light to the nations. I just was reading a testimony today. A 75-year-old Jewish man was searching. He found my television program. He said it put it all together to him. He received Jesus. I read a testimony just a couple weeks ago. 16-year-old Jewish boy was watching me on television, received Jesus. I'm telling you, God is sending his word forth through Jewish people today. And God's plan is this, that there's a mass of Jewish people around the earth that will come to faith in Yeshua HaMashiach. And when this critical mass of Jewish people, beloved one, comes to faith, it's going to usher in the return of Messiah Yeshua HaMashiach himself. So I want to thank you for just investing a few minutes of your time to find out a little bit about who I am in my life, to understand why I have the passion for what I do, and I hope and pray that you'll be very blessed by the ministry of Discovering the Jewish Jesus.